lamb has died.
Scotland's relationship with England has always been uneasy. And from the beginning of the 17th century, Lowland Scots were planted in the Ulster. This was to reawaken Ulster's economy after Elizabeth I's war with the Irish Earls.
It's a very difficult period, particularly for Presbyterian or Covenanter groups within Scotland, and they experienced great hardship, particularly under the Stuarts, under Charles II and then under James II, and the government is arrayed against them. You see them having to worship out in the heather, and they're hunted and they're harried in the heather by government forces because they won't conform to the establishment, they won't conform to the established church.
James II initially had the backing of those who controlled the lands north of the Humber, and in 1667 a Scotch-Dutch regiment was raised. But the monarch's actions would anger his allies, and it wasn't long before those armies would be used against him.
When James II comes to the throne, and there's an initial rebellion against him by the Duke of Monmouth, and it's brutally crushed by James II and people like commanders like Percy Kirk, who will go on to liberate Londonderry after the siege. He is brought back, and his regiment really do go after the rebels. But James proves himself to be a tyrant, and as a consequence of that, you see the political establishment, the military commanders, the church leaders all coming together right across England and Scotland, and the invitation is issued to William Prince of Orange and his wife Mary to come and take the British throne, and the balance of power shifts from just being confined to that of the monarch or the monarchy to the people in Parliament.
A now deposed King James travels from France to Ireland. His Jacobite army must find a deep water port to gain a passage to Scotland. But the lowland plantation Scots put up resistance, allowing William's army time to move into Ulster and ruin James's plans.
So he moves very quickly with his troops north, but there are pockets of resistance, and those are largely of those planter stock, those, if you like, Ulster Scots personalities, those families that have grown up over 2 generations and beyond. And they hold places like Enniskillen, Londonderry, they make stands in Killalay and Dromore. They hold out long enough for William to supply troops and reinforcements from the rest of the British Isles. And the war then for the Glorious Revolution, or to secure the Glorious Revolution, will take place in Ireland.
The England to catch is brave.
On April 18th, 1689, the Jacobites laid siege to the city of Derry. It lasted for 105 days and left 8,000 dead. It is known that even children were involved in the fighting, and one young man would write his place in history.
James MacGregor is known as the Moses of the Scots-Irish. He was born in Magilligan in 1677. Now, we know very little about his family. We know his father was a Captain David MacGregor, probably a yeomanry captain. But during the siege of Londonderry, he, his father, his mother, his brother and sister were all in the city. He becomes notable in the city because he is said to be the boy, 12 years of age, who fires the cannon from the top of St Columb's Cathedral when he sees the ships coming up the river, the Mountjoy, and the 2 other ships which have broken the boom.
Over the next 9 years, the civil and religious freedoms that so many had fought for were now being denied by church and state.
For Presbyterians in this era, life had become very difficult at the beginning of the 18th century. The Test Act was passed. Now, this really was penal laws against the Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians saw this as betrayal. They had fought for the Williamite Wars, they had supported the government, and now the government was banning them. Presbyterian marriages, Presbyterian funerals were banned, children were declared illegitimate, they had to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland, public office was closed to them, and so many Presbyterians felt aggrieved. They wanted difference, they wanted to get out of this.
Many of those in Ulster saw America as an opportunity to have a new way of life and the religious and civil opportunities that they yearned for. Their leader and pastor was James McGregor.
Now, what do they take with them? They take with them their spinning wheels. They take with them flax seed. They take seed potatoes. These things will be of benefit to them. All plans are arranged. But one of the saddest things that locally is what we call the living wakes. There were no dead people, but they might as well be dead. That was the night you left. Your family would come, your friends, your neighbours, and they would gather. And there would be hymn singing, there would be music. It wouldn't be a happy occasion.
5 ships would leave from Coleraine and Londonderry, and at the mouth of the Foyle River, Colmore Fort would be the last sight they would have of Ireland. A new world and a new adventure now lay ahead.
Presbyterians were not as tied down as they are today, I think, with rules. The church was the church, the Sabbath was the Sabbath, but outside that, they enjoyed their music. They liked their fiddle playing, they liked the violin, they even liked a wee bit of dancing. And we're told locally that they were fond of a wee bit of potching. It wasn't against the law to have a wee drink now and again. And they were a happy people. They were a God-fearing, hard-working, and, they were a rough people in many ways. They weren't delicate in that sense, but they were the sort of people who would survive well in America.
This really was the tale of two cities. To steal a quote, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And when the 5 ships reached the New World, they really did hope that the worst of times were behind them. They had faced high seas, the potential for piracy, starvation and disease. The 5 ships would not only bring resourceful people, but political thought. And unbeknown to those on board, their actions in Ireland had already caused unrest in the New World.
Particularly those Ulster Scots personalities in the 17th century, those tens of thousands of people who migrate to what becomes the United States, those ideas, those theological principles, those political ideas all travel with them. So it's a migration not just of people, but of principles and beliefs. And that goes on to form the bedrock of what becomes the United States.
During the Williamite Wars in 1689, when James II is sort of overthrown and all the Derry and Londonderry fighting starts happening, we get word of that here in New England. And what that causes here is another revolt where New Englanders rise up and they oust Edmund Andros. They put our former governor, Simon Bradstreet, back in control, and we sort of reestablish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. None of that could have happened without the Williamite Wars and without what happened in Londonderry, especially with the ousting of James II.
At first, the Puritans were uncertain about their new arrivals and their perceived lack of conservative values. They soon found common ground, though, in their quest for religious freedom.
And of course, the Puritans in 1630 were fleeing, a lot of them, from Denmark because they had been ousted for religious persecution from England. So from very early on, especially with Andros in 1689, what you see here is all of these people that had been connected banding together because it is this anti-corruption sentiment, which has always been purely New England.
Worcester lies about 40 miles west of Boston. It's known as the heart of the Commonwealth. But back in the 1700s, it was no more than a frontier's village.
So you would have to travel from Boston down the Indian Path, Indian Paths were only about this wide. They were only a foot wide. They weren't very large. You would be single file. Horseback, you would be single file. There was not enough room for a stagecoach.
The unannounced arrival of the Scots-Irish was scorned upon by the establishment, and as a result, they were split into 3 groups. Among those in the Worcester placement was the Young family. The oldest was 95, and he had brought the first seed potatoes to America that at first was greeted with suspicion.
The Governor Shute was his name. He got really upset because he saw all these people arriving in Boston and he didn't know what to do. So he decided he was going to divide them into 3 groups and send them to 3 different places to reinforce populations because of the Indian attacks. So he sent 200 people to Maine, 200 people to Londonderry, New Hampshire, and 200 people to Worcester. When they got here in Worcester, the people that were already here, about 200 of them, and they were upset because they didn't like these people because they were different and they had different clothing, they spoke different, but they had gifts of the potato and the spinning wheel, and the Congregationalists were also afraid of that potato and they threw it away. So it took a couple of seasons before they realized that they could eat the potato. They were trying to eat the tubers and the leaves, which didn't work out right. You know, that's not good. Poisonous. So eventually they figured out how to eat the potato, and it became a very sustainable fruit or vegetable in New England, and a lot of potato farms are in Maine.
The hostilities towards the families in Worcester would see them being forced to move on, and they would rejoin their countrymen further north.
The people in Worcester tried to drive the Scots out of here. Get out of my town. It was pretty much, they burned their church down, and they did whatever they could to drive them away, and a lot of them founded Pelham and Rutland and Colebrook Springs to the west of us. And that's where the potato farms are in Massachusetts.
America was a new world. It had no rail or road networks. The only way of travelling about was by river. Our Ulster Scots had been rejected from Boston, branded as Irish. They protested how they'd fought for King William and country. They moved north to Merrimack River and found winter lodgings in Haverhill.
So some of the things that were established under the 1691 Charter, besides sort of being able to appoint your own government officials in several capacities here in the colonies, one of the other things it did is actually establish a freedom of worship for Christians here in New England. And this sort of angered the Puritans because this was a Puritan state until that time, so it did cause a rift as much as it brought people together. But exclusively, that religious freedom excluded Catholics, which were named Papists in the 1691 Charter that was given to the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
As the group had proved their religious credentials, offers of land were made to them. But this was in an area known for harsh winters.
The first grant that they got was actually up near Portland, Maine. They were up there in the winter of 1718, but they arrived so late in the year that while a few of them managed to build a couple of huts and shelter, the rest of them had to winter on the boat. They pretty much starved because they didn't have enough supply. And they turned around and went back to the Merrimack River and were on the boat in the Merrimack River at the town of Haverhill. Now in those days, the town of Haverhill extended right up through Derry and now part of Londonderry. And some of that land had already been granted, but they came up and settled on it anyway, because although it had been granted, it hadn't been settled. Farmers were using it for grazing, and that was about all.
Months of discussion would follow, and eventually the group would own their own lands. A local government was formed, and the community's skill set would prove to be invaluable.
They used the skills that they brought with them from the old country, put them to use here, and then just had the vision to expand upon those skills, take advantage of the new resources, and create a new and prosperous country and a new and enlightened form of government.
After such a shaky start, our band of Ulster Scots would find their new home in a place called Nutfield, now known as Londonderry and Derry. With no crops planted, the year of 1719 would be all about survival, and help came from an unlikely source.
The Native Americans that were still here introduced them to the river and Amoskeag Falls, just a short, like 12 miles to our west. And eels were plentiful there, and so they apparently spent most of the first winter eating eels and potatoes.
Grants of land came with conditions, and East Derry would be the centre of the settlers' attention.
The way the settlement went, they were all given home lots of 60 acres. A condition of that was they had to build a house on it within 3 years, and they had to cultivate 3 acres within 4 years. Otherwise, they lost the grant.
There could be no doubt that education and religion travelled with them, as did their skills that would give them the income to develop their communities.
First settlers that came were very pious men and women, obviously very tough men and women, and very skilled men and women. And for the first 100 years in this community, they grew flax, and the flax industry became such that the founding fathers of this nation, and I'm talking George Washington himself and Thomas Jefferson, were very proud to be clad in Londonderry linen, made and milled right here in this town.
Utilising their natural resources, coupled with their tenacity to survive, the Merrimack and Kennebec rivers would become their lifeblood.
The river system, as well as the lakes and ponds that were in the area, were great for bringing in the fishing, as well as when we had dairy, Hood Dairy, which is a huge milk and dairy company that's based out of Boston, started here. Part of the reason they started here was not only the open pasture lands, but the ponds that we had in the wintertime. They would chop it up for ice, and then they would put the ice in barns. And when they harvested the ice, they could then cool the milk and put it on carts that, train cars that went down to Boston every day.
As each colony became established, the opportunity was given to purchase more land. The town of Derry had grown substantially, and they were now expanding. So in 1770, the next generation built a new town.
These very hard-working settlers were originally from Londonderry, New Hampshire, or as they used to call it, Old Nutfield. And many of them arrived in the spring of 1770 and set right to work clearing their lands and building small log cabins. And by the year 1773, they decided it was time to incorporate as a town. They needed to raise taxes. They had so many people who had purchased their lands here in Belfast, but were not living here yet, and they needed a way to collect monies from them to make improvements to the town, like roads, schools, meeting houses. So legend has it that they flipped a coin to choose between either Londonderry or Belfast. Coin flip was made and Belfast won out, and so we were incorporated as Belfast in June 21, 1773.
Belfast, Maine isn't just another twin city. It can trace its DNA to the 1700s. The Ulster men and women that came here were determined to build a town that would not only last, but flourish.
They are still here. You walk around town and I know Gilmores, I know Durhams, I know Stevensons, I know Browns, that there are many, many generations of early Belfastians that are still here.
In such a heavily wooded area, trying to get access for trade would be a problem. While clearing the land, they used all their skills to recycle and start an industry that would not only grow, but become a major employer.
I think the skills come from the old country. I think they come from Belfast, Northern Ireland. You know, when you're busy cutting down the forest to build your homesteads, you suddenly have to do something with the wood, and you use it for yourself for cordwood. But very quickly they realized, their main trade partner in this time period would be Boston. So they immediately set to work building their own ships and building their own wharves to get their goods out to the rest of the world.
Just as its namesake, Belfast, Maine, would build and supply many of the ships that would build a nation. On March 5th, 1729, James MacGregor died of a fever. He was buried in the forest graveyard beside the First Presbyterian Church in Derry. Alongside him are many of those that made that original journey. There is no doubt what he witnessed in the Williamite Wars had a profound effect on him. He was determined to create a place that his community could call home, and their civil liberties and religious freedoms would be commonplace. Their can-do attitude and work ethic is embedded and can still be seen to this very day.
MacGregor, I think with his history, learned to rise above relatively petty things like persecution and so forth. Some call him a peacemaker, but he's also known for every sermon he would have his rifle with him.
They colored outside the lines. They did what they had to do at the time because it answered the need of their community. I love that. It's like the ingenuity and the problem solving is in the DNA of the church. And after talking to various historians, I've got to say that it goes back to Pastor MacGregor and all the ways that he thought outside the box.
They are still here, and they're still working hard, and they've started businesses. And and then you look around Belfast and you look at the houses and you look at our beautiful downtown. I mean, this is the result of their hard work in those first years.
Some of them were certainly well educated. James McKean and James Gregg were the two real civic leaders. MacGregor was more of a religious leader.
As journalists, we're all taught to revise and know the facts before we start in a story. And before I came here, I had done just that. I had researched James MacGregor, trying to find out the most I could about the man and his situation. But to really get to know him, you have to come here to New Hampshire. You have to see what he was striving for and for the people that he brought with him. But he also took care of his community. The very documents that were signed as the ships came into Boston clearly stated that none of them were to be sold. But what's most interesting here is that these people, these Ulster Scots, didn't keep their former identity. They weren't Irish Americans. They were quite simply patriots and the first Americans.